People say there is no censorship industrial complex. People say the idea that there's a censorship industrial complex is a conspiracy theory. It's disinformation. And yet, we know that Facebook censored what its own executives called often true stories of COVID vaccine side effects. We know that Facebook censored the New York Post in February 2020 when it published an opinion piece that said maybe COVID came from a laboratory. And we know that Twitter and Facebook censored an entirely 100% true, accurate story about Hunter Biden's laptop just 2 weeks before the US elections. Now, people say it's not really censorship, because censorship is when the government censors you. And the government was just flagging misinformation. They were just being helpful, helping Twitter executives and Facebook to correct the misinformation out there. And yet Matt Taibbi and his colleagues at Racket have identified 50 large, powerful organizations around the world that take government funding, that are staffed by former government employees, that work hand in hand with the US government, the UK government, the Brazilian government, the Canadian government, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland. Around the world, we see censorship. And censorship at the behest of governments is a violation of the First Amendment and a violation of your laws, too, in the great nation of Britain. So we're here tonight to get into it. What is the censorship industrial complex? How did we allow this monstrosity to take hold in our societies? It's every time we think we get to the bottom of this story, the floor drops out from under us. Most recently, just a few weeks ago, we started getting emails from people around the world, from Australia, from New Zealand, from Canada, the United States, saying, did you know that there's a piece of legislation going through our parliament, our Congress? It's not being covered by the news media. What is it? In the UK, there's legislation that would allow the government to read your private direct messages on WhatsApp, Signal, Telegraph. In Brazil, a single judge on the Supreme Court is demanding the right for the government to read and censor private text messages. In Canada, they're seeking legislation that would promote official government media sources over independent news media sources on social media platforms. In the United States, they've been trying to sneak through legislation that would criminalize the use of VPNs, or virtual private networks, to gain access to forbidden websites. In Ireland, this is the most shocking thing of all. They're trying to get the right to go into your homes, into the homes of people in Ireland, including the staffs of social media companies, search their phones, search their computers without authorization, and presume people guilty until proven innocent of spreading hateful material. Hateful speech should be condemned. We should use our freedom of speech to condemn it. But our societies are more tolerant of racial, religious, and sexual minorities than they have ever been. Think about the attitudes of your grandparents and great-grandparents. In 1958, 4% of Americans approved of the rights of whites and black people to be married. Today, over 95% do. Who is driving the hate speech? Who is demanding the censorship of hate speech? I would say it's some of the most hateful people in our society. Who hates the speech? It's the elites, and they want to censor the people. They want to censor the authentic voice of the people, and I tell you tonight, they will not succeed. And sacred space. There's always been a debate about whether or not you need free speech to make democracy work. We know we do. You can't choose your elected representatives if you cannot freely debate who they are, what they stand for. People make the case that you need freedom of speech in order to have free markets work. You can't know what to buy or sell if you aren't allowed to discuss those products freely and openly. We have very few restrictions on our freedom of speech. You can't lie to people to steal from them through fraud, and you can't incite violence against people in the immediate term. But beyond that, our rights are very strong. They're the strongest in the United States of anywhere in the world, but they're very strong in Britain, and they should be stronger. We are here to launch a campaign, a new free speech alliance. We've brought people from around the world. I just met many of them, and these are people who I only see online. These are people fighting for their freedom in Brazil, in New Zealand, Australia, Canada. We're meeting for the first time because we believe that free speech isn't just an enabling condition for civilization, for democracy, that it's a fundamental human right. Free speech is what makes us human. It's tantamount to our ability to breathe and to eat and to love who we want to love. The most painful thing, and there's a lot of painful things that one goes through, is losing almost all of your friends as a consequence of using your speech. The only positive thing that's come out of that has been to make new friends. And it's not the most obvious thing in the world to lose all your friends in your late 40s. The ones you keep are so dear, and the ones that you make dearer so. And there's few people in the world that I admire more than Matt Taibbi.
I went into the Twitter Files story, probably like Michael, bringing my old school, legalistic, kind of Enlightenment era notions of free speech with me. And I was hoping to answer maybe one or two narrow questions about Twitter. You know, for instance, did the FBI maybe once or twice intervene to, get in the middle of a speech question? Quickly, we all realized that it was something sort of bigger, scarier, and weirder than that. And here's what I wrote about that. The quote is, "A sweeping system of digital surveillance combined with thousands or even millions of subtle rewards and punishments designed to condition people to censor themselves." So we're going to get into the concrete examples of how they did use government, and government did work with these companies to actually censor people. But the larger, scarier issue is the construction, I think, of this gigantic internet age system that is designed to get people to preempt dangerous thoughts by getting people to avoid having them in the first place. And then there was another pretentious thing about George Orwell. And the idea here was that one of the things that Orwell focused on in 1984 was this notion of binaries, that in the world that he described in 1984, there were no shades of gray. Like, all ambiguities and shades of meaning had been purged. And it wasn't necessary to have words for everything. You didn't need to have words for warm and cold. You could just have warm and unwarm, for instance, right? And this is what we saw a lot of in the Twitter Files. We saw a lot of taking very complex issues where there were lots and lots of shades of meaning and finding ways to whittle it down to basically two things, right? And a great example of this was the Virality Project that was led by Stanford University. This was basically a catch-all program where Stanford took in information from all the biggest internet platforms, Facebook, Google, Twitter, some others, and they sort of aggregated all the things that they were hearing about COVID and their experiences about what content moderation decisions that they made, and they made recommendations to each of the platforms about how they should deal with these things. And the really fascinating thing about this, well, first let's start with the headline, sort of scary moment in these emails. There was one email in which Stanford suggested to Twitter that you should consider, as standard misinformation on your platform, stories of true vaccine side effects, or true posts which could fuel hesitancy, as well as worrisome jokes or posts about things like natural immunity or vaccinated individuals contracting COVID-19 anyway. And basically what they were doing here is they were trying to get into the minds of millions of people through algorithms. That if a person was telling a true story about somebody who got the vaccine and got myocarditis, they didn't have to say that they got it because of the vaccine. Even if they just told the story, even if in the next post they said, I'm all for the vaccine, the way that the Virality Project interpreted that original post was that this could promote hesitancy. Therefore, even if it's true, it's untrue, right? So you have, in reality, you have shades of meaning there. There's a true story that suggests that maybe you should be cautious about the virus. The person might be pro-vaccine, but they see it as anti-vax material. So it's vax, anti-vax, right? And this is constantly throughout. They just took things that were really somewhere in the middle and they moved them in one direction or another. Another amazing moment was when there was a company called Graphica, which described the dangers of undermining what they called authoritative health sources, like Anthony Fauci. They were very against even the use of puns like FAUXI, F-A-U-X-I. And their quote was, "This continual process of seeding doubt and uncertainty in inauthoritative voices leads to a society that finds it too challenging to identify what's true or false." So basically what they're saying is questioning authority. Everybody who here is old enough to remember the 70s and the VW bugs that had the questioning authority stickers? Questioning authority, which was a liberal value then, is now disinformation. So if you apply these techniques 50, 100 million times, a billion times, a billion times, eventually what happens is that people see that they are either going to be defined as approved, having approved thoughts, or unapproved thoughts. If there's no middle that they can occupy, they will just naturally self-sort and self-homogenize. And we're doing this all throughout society with politics, entertainment, and everything. That's how you can get somebody like Russell, who is clearly not a right-winger, but they define him as a right-winger anyway because there are only two categories of people in the current media environment. There are people who believe in everything true and decent and democracy and puppies and all that, and then there's right-wingers who are wrong about everything, right, basically. And so that's what they've been doing. They've been creating binaries over and above the direct censorship that we saw. There's this relentless effort to sort people into categories. And the other thing that I think is really important to point out, and is another Orwell concept, is doublethink. And this is the idea, how did Orwell define this? Basically, it's the idea of holding two ideas at the same time. He defined it as the act of holding simultaneously two opposite, individually exclusive ideas or opinions, and believing in both simultaneously and absolutely. Now, we do that. We do that constantly now. With news stories, things that were true yesterday turn out to be completely the opposite tomorrow, and people are totally fine with that. We just completely skip the fixing process. There's no stopping to say, oh, sorry, we got that wrong. We just move to freaking out about the next thing seamlessly. So just to take an example, it wasn't that long ago that we were told in no uncertain terms that the only suspect in the Nord Stream pipeline bombing was Russia itself. And just a couple of weeks ago, we were told by the same US government that they were actually aware since last June that this was planned by Ukrainians with the assent of the highest officials in the Ukrainian military. Now, I don't know what the true story is, but those two stories are completely different. And they don't stop and say, oh, well, we're sorry, let's resolve that, let's square this discrepancy. They just want you to forget. And there's no way for people to live normally with these contradictions and stay sane. The only thing they can do is live continuously in the moment, because that way you don't have to think about the past, you don't have to think about the future. You are sort of charged affirmatively to forget everything that you were told before, because it might turn out to contradict something they want to tell you tomorrow. So we live in the present continually, and in the present, there are only two choices. So we are living in this very, very narrow intellectual world, and this is over and above the problem of authority that would come in later. If you somehow manage to get past all these obstacles and actually be an independent free thinker, like I think most of the people in this room are, then they're going to have censorship and other obstacles to try to stop you. But their aim is to prevent that from ever happening. And we saw that over and over in the Twitter files. I think that's the lesson that I ended up taking away from it. And this is, I think, more than a speech crisis. It's a humanity crisis, and I just hope we're not too late to fix it. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a great day.
Sure. I mean, I think we had these various moments on the Twitter files where you would just get really creeped out. Like you would discover something and you would just get chills up your spine. And for me, it was when we discovered that the Aspen Institute had organized a workshop, they called it tabletop exercise, that had New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, Facebook, Twitter, 12 to 20 people there, all talking in the summer of 2020 about how to debunk a story about Hunter Biden and Burisma. This is 3 months before the Hunter Biden laptop had come out. And it was just like, what is going on here? We sometimes ask, is this a conspiracy or is it just a culture? Because there is a way in which, that looked like conspiracy. That looked like a secret, coordinated effort that was obviously not public to pre-bunk a story that would come out several months later. On the other hand, it's also a culture. These are people that are in Washington, D.C. together. They go to the same parties. They went to the same prep schools. They went to the same Ivy League schools. They got jobs at the top newspapers. When they come to London, they hang out with the same particular, group of people. But I think we're constantly asking ourselves, to what extent is this, an inorganic phenomenon of a censorship industrial complex, and to what extent is it an organic part of cancel culture? I mean, I thought, Russell, what you said is really to the point, which is that there's, and also to Matt's comments about Orwell, is that there's something that's unhealthy psychologically about this. And we've all become obsessed, my colleagues and I, with this totally obscure book by a Polish psychologist who lived under the Nazis, then also under communists. And the book is called Political Ponerology, which is this crazy word I think he invented, which is the study of evil or the study of totalitarianism. And what he says is, people that are in totalitarian societies, the people in charge, he says the way that you get to totalitarian societies is that psychopathological people, or what psychologists call cluster B personality disorder type people, these are antisocial personality disorder, which is the new name for psychopaths, narcissists, borderline personality, and histrionic disorder. These are all cluster B personality. These are the folks who, like when you're around them in your life, you always feel a little bit like you're walking on eggshells because anything you say might set them off or might offend them. And I'm also struck by that Orwell, where Orwell is saying, in a totalitarian society, it's either black or white, and that's actually one of the characteristics of cluster B personality disorder people. Is that, these are people that are marked by grandiosity, self-centeredness, and then this concept that we just learned, which is called splitting. So these are people for whom you're either with me or you're against me, and it's just, that's the way their world is. And so, and when we start to, without naming names, you start to learn some of the characters in the censorship industrial complex, and you sort of watch them and you realize you're dealing with people that there's something pathological about the way that they're, the way they look at the world, the way in which it's like you're either with the program or you're dead to me. and there's no sense of play and like humor is impossible in that situation. There's a reason why you feel scared to make a joke around those kinds of people.
In February, early February, I was looking through the Twitter files and we started to run into emails about an organization called the Global Engagement Center. How many people here have heard of the Global Engagement Center? Almost nobody, right? Which is so fascinating. So the Global Engagement Center was created in the last year of Barack Obama's presidency. Technically, it's what they call housed in the State Department. It's actually a multi-agency task force whose official remit is combating foreign disinformation. And we found an Inspector General's report that said basically that the Global Engagement Center in its first year, I guess it was FY 2017, had funded roughly $100 million worth of projects, and it listed 36 different organizations, or 39, and of course 36 of them were redacted, and I got the idea that it might be a good thing to try to figure out what those organizations were. We brought in some more people to start looking, and the instant we started trying to figure out how many of these organizations were, the project completely spiraled out of control. Michael mentioned 50. The real number that we're looking at now is somewhere in the 400s. It's like 400, 450. We've begun keeping sort of an Excel-type spreadsheet with all of these organizations, and we think even that is only scratching the surface of how many of these quote-unquote anti-disinformation organizations that are out there. A lot of them are receiving public money. What are they doing? What's the genesis of these groups? Well, in the case of the Global Engagement Center, the real origin of this is, as was described to me by somebody who worked there from the very beginning, this started with the counter-proliferation movement in the US military. Essentially, they were having trouble countering the messaging of ISIS, which they were finding difficulty understanding. Like the ISIS was somehow reaching basically white suburban kids in Britain and in America. And of course, when something happens to white suburban kids anywhere, then it becomes a crisis internationally. They started pouring money into it, but that was the original remit of the Global Engagement Center. And so they went from counterterrorism to basically what they do now is counterpopulism. It's the same people, they're using the same technologies, and they're using the same techniques to try to identify people that they consider problematic and try to find ways to diffuse that messaging, either using counter messaging or de-amplifying the messaging or removing it from platforms or whatever it is. To them, it's the same thing, and that's what's so frightening. I think that people have to understand is that this all starts in a wing of the government that was looking at what they considered a terrorist threat that you could use basically any technique against and it would be legitimate, up to and including droning them. And they turned that entire mechanism inward, and that's really what the censorship industrial complex is. It's just taking the techniques that we were using to try to reduce the impact of sort of foreign terrorist communication and turning it inward on domestic unrest, people complaining about things, people complaining about the electoral process, people not getting vaccinated when they're told, whatever it is, there's always some emergency, and they've learned that they can continually apply that over and over again. And that, I find that terrifying. I don't know about you, Russell, but I think it's very scary.
Yes, the idea of perpetual and never-ending crisis being a precondition for authoritarianism is by its nature terrifying, as is the shift that a mechanic designed in order to deal with an apparently external threat being inverted to deal with an internal threat, particularly using some of the psychological critiques that have been touched upon. That indicates a kind of implosion that's difficult not to equate with pre-apocalyptic thinking. Furthermore, to see the figures, and I'm referring directly to both of you, of course, that would once have been cherished by identifiable legacy media outlets, even if they're glib, somewhat cultural artifacts like Rolling Stone, or legacy media outlets like the New York Times, that it's unthinkable that Maibbi or Michael Shellenberger could reliably and consistently write for those kind of outlets. This too is an indication that things are changing, and they're just two examples. Of course, Chris Hedges has had a comparable trajectory, and most obviously perhaps Glenn Greenwald, who's gone from breaking the seismic stories around WikiLeaks and Snowden and Chelsea Manning to being a literal exile and pariah. These are all, I would say, significantly terrifying alterations and changes. Might I ask, if there is an underlying ideology here, because sometimes to hear the way that Matt has described it then, it just feels like a kind of utilization of a creation just because it's there. It has to be used. But I wonder, Michael, if the imperatives that undergird this new fast-moving, observably fast-moving trajectory towards authoritarianism, censorship, and centralization is primarily motivated by dominion, power, money, or is there something ideological and political taking place, or is it both? And if so, how do they intersect, please?
Yeah, I mean, this thing where I think that you guys have both just tapped into this sort of the central issue, which is that there is an authoritarian mentality among the leaders of the censorship industrial complex. I always think of this, do you guys know the Bourne movie, not the one with Matt Damon, but the other guy? And they go in to kill Rachel Weisz. You guys know what I'm talking about? Okay, everybody remembers that scene? It was Jeremy Renner, right? Do you remember the scene where like they go into her, I'm gonna spoil the movie for you guys if you haven't seen it, but there's like, I guess it's like CIA or FBI, and they go into the house and they're like trying to be like empathic with her because she's been through this trauma, and then they sit her down and then they just look at each other and they're like, now, and then they like try to kill her. And that's kind of the scene that has kept coming up in my mind as I'm like reading these documents and listening and like reading the things that people are saying. It's like, I feel like there's a lot of, like they're running an operation. You know, you feel like you look at these people. I wrote a piece about one person who's a former CIA fellow. I'm very sensitive about not wanting to personalize it, so I'm even hesitant to use this person's name, but I did write a whole piece about her. And, you know, it was like, her story was she was just this hobbyist, you know, and I was just concerned about anti-vaxxers. And then, you know, and then the next thing you know, I was advising Obama on fighting ISIS. And I just remember being like, I don't think it works like that. You know, like, I think it's like, these are like really hierarchical military intelligence organizations, and that this is a person who came out of, you know, and I don't know if she, you know, was recruited out of the NSA, which does all the spy satellites and whatnot, but, you know, this particular kind of a peculiar career. And then she's been, I think, one of the most important intellectual architects of the censorship industrial complex. And, you know, you would listen to her and it'd be like talking about like reducing harm in the real world and using very progressive language, like that's like language of compassion. And we have to reduce harm. I mean, that's been a big part of it. We have to reduce hatred in the society. And then it just feels like that moment from, you know, the Bourne movie where it's like, and then we have to, you know, fight the disinformation. And so, you know, I have to say, I think like that seems to be, I mean, that seems to be like the undercurrent, is that I think that that what brings us all together is a kind of suspicion of authority. I mean, my dad had, not only did he have a Beetle, a VW Bug, we had the Question Authority sticker on the car. I mean, that was who we were. And so for me, that was a part of it. And I think one of the delightful parts of it is that there's people in this anti-censorship movement, this free speech movement, who, you know, like there was a guy that had blocked me because we had been in this huge fight about nuclear power, which is something that I support. A lot of the folks that are very anti-authoritarian are anti-nuclear. And I actually asked him recently to stop blocking me on Twitter, and he did, because we're on the same side of this. And so, but I do feel like, yeah, that seems like that's a big part of it, is that if there's an ideology, it's just some of it's like just questioning authority and, being able to have a conversation and ask hard questions of people and not kind of not wanting to be in a situation of just following orders.
My concern is that the end point of this is an inability to openly communicate in good faith, in particular with people that you disagree with. It's interesting that Matt Taibbi uses as his framework George Orwell, and you use a lesser-known Bourne film. Not even the main ones. Do you think, Matt, that this sort of like oddly mercurial shape-shifting, I probably shouldn't use conspiracy theory type language, should I, in this context? Do you think that this odd pathology might afford the possibility that many of the agencies and key figures that profess concern around misinformation and its linguistic acolytes, mal and dis, I think are the other ones you can have, aren't there? Miss, mal, dis.
Miss, mal, yeah. Mal, miss, and dis, yeah.
Like Scrooge's nephews in the DuckTales films, which I reckon Michael will probably use as a paradigm in a minute. Do you reckon that some of them agencies that are like, oh no, we've got to watch all this misinformation, are actually culpable for themselves spreading misinformation?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, but I don't think Russell, I don't think they see it as disinformation. I think they see things as politically true, even if they're factually, proven untrue later, right? Michael and I, just in the last week or so, we've gotten in the middle of this story involving the origins of COVID-19. Now this is really a fascinating episode in kind of world history, because this thing happened, and immediately, before we had any answer as to the cause of the pandemic, a whole universe of possibilities was ruled out. We were basically just told, it can't be this, so let's not look over there. Yeah. And that is something that maybe you might see somebody in the military think, but a journalist should never think like that, right? We should always, first of all, we shouldn't really care. Like, all the old journalists that I know would they would start with indifference. I'm happy to report this if this is true. I'm happy to report that if that's true. But we were told, basically, no, this is the new version of how we do information in the world is that things are right and righteous, and that you have to get behind them emotionally as you're reporting them. And therefore, there's this extraordinary incentive to become a believer. It's much more like religion than journalism, I think. And that, I think that's kind of the same precondition you have to fight a war. You have to believe in something. You have to believe it in your gut in order to press a button to drone somebody. I don't know. I think it's very strange. It's so different from how I was raised to view journalism, but what they've succeeded in doing, and I was going to ask you about this because you're in this very strange position with YouTube and Rumble and everything, where you have to be constantly thinking, what are they going to consider real and what are they going to consider off limits? And how do you do humor in a situation like that? How do you do reporting in a situation like that? Look at the New York. The New York Times had to basically write around stories about Nord Stream. The Wall Street Journal is now having to write around stories about the COVID leak. There was a story last week about neo-Nazi emblems in Ukraine, and they had to frame it as this might hurt the war effort by making Russian propaganda look good, as opposed to just reporting it. So they've turned us into believers instead of just sort of passive consumers and judges who are interested. And